for her behavior after causing the deadly high-speed crash that killed her boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and his friend, 19-year-old Davian Flanagan.
But from my observations, there was never any, behaviors that looked like somebody who was remorseful. So lots of laughing, lots of giggling, makeup done every day. It was never this dark, smug, tough girl.
The city of Strongsville, Ohio, is the kind of quiet, tree-lined suburb where people go to escape the chaos of the city. It is a place where the streets are wide, the lawns are manicured, and the silence of the early morning is rarely broken by anything louder than the chirp of awakening birds. But in the pre-dawn darkness of July 31st, 22, that silence was shattered by a sound so violent, so unnatural, that it would haunt the residents of Progressive Drive for years to come. It was 5:45 a.m. The sky was still a bruised, deep purple, clinging to the final moments of night. Through the empty, winding roads of a desolate business park, a black Toyota Camry tore through the shadows. There was no screech of brakes. There was no sudden swerve of panic. There was only the deafening, high-pitched scream of a four-cylinder engine pushed far beyond its limits. The car was traveling at 100 miles per hour, guided by a driver who was not trying to navigate the road, but rather trying to end it. Within seconds, the vehicle careened off the asphalt, launched over a curb, and slammed directly into the solid brick wall of Plux Cleaners. The impact was catastrophic. The front end of the car folded inward like an accordion, the metal tearing, the glass exploding into a million shimmering shards that rained down onto the empty parking lot. And then there was only silence. No sirens, no screams. Just the ticking of a dying engine, and the thick, heavy smell of gasoline and burning rubber mixing with the humid morning air. For nearly 45 minutes, the wreckage sat undiscovered in the shadows of the business park. It wasn't until a passerby noticed the mangled heap of metal that the first frantic call to 911 was made. When first responders arrived, they found a scene of absolute devastation. Inside the crushed cabin of the Camry, two young men sat motionless. 20-year-old Dominic Russo and his close friend, 19-year-old Davian Pratt, had been killed instantly by the sheer force of the impact. But in the driver's seat, trapped beneath the collapsed dashboard, was 17-year-old MacKenzie Shirilla. She was unconscious, her body broken, but her heart was still beating. To the local news, it looked like a horrific, tragic accident, a group of teenagers driving too fast in the dark, losing control on a quiet road. But as investigators began to pull back the layers of MacKenzie Shirilla's life, a much darker, far more sinister reality began to emerge. This was no accident. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution. The media would quickly dub her the Hell on Wheels killer, and a highly publicized trial would eventually land her behind bars for life. But there is a part of this story that has remained locked away in the shadows, largely untouched by mainstream documentaries and television specials. To truly understand why Dominic Russo and Davian Pratt died that morning, we have to look beyond the courtroom. We have to look at the toxic, enabling environment that bred MacKenzie Shirilla. We have to examine the frantic, hidden text messages, the desperate phone calls, and the disturbing role her mother and family played in the months leading up to, and directly following, the crash. Welcome to True Crime Exposure. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the secrets the documentaries left out. This is the untold story of MacKenzie Shirilla's family, the warning signs that were actively ignored, and the chilling digital trail that exposed a nightmare long before the car ever hit the wall. If you want to support the channel and help us continue bringing you these deep dive investigations, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to True Crime Exposure, turn on your notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support allows us to keep digging for the truth. To understand the volatile explosion that occurred on July 31st, we must first look at the volatile elements that were mixed together in the months prior. At the center of this tragedy was the relationship between MacKenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo. On the outside, They looked like any other young couple navigating their late teens. Dominic was a handsome, entrepreneurial young man who ran his own clothing line. He was known for his warm smile, his laid-back demeanor, and his deep loyalty to his friends, especially Davian Pratt, a fiercely protective and kind-hearted aspiring athlete. MacKenzie, on the other hand, was a force of nature, but not in a way that brought light. She was deeply insecure, highly volatile, and possessed an obsessive, controlling personality that seemed to consume everyone in her orbit. Those close to the couple began to notice that their relationship wasn't just dramatic, it was toxic. It was a cycle of extreme highs and violent, screaming lows. But while the public trial focused heavily on MacKenzie's personal rage, the secret text messages and calls between MacKenzie, Dominic, and their respective families reveal an enabling structure that practically guaranteed a disastrous end. In the Shirilla household, MacKenzie was treated not as a troubled teenager who needed boundaries, but as a golden child who could do no wrong. Her mother, Natalie Shirilla, was not just a parent. She was MacKenzie's confidant, her defender, and as the evidence would later suggest, her ultimate enabler. In a series of text messages that never made it to the front pages, the dynamic between mother and daughter becomes chillingly clear. Whenever MacKenzie faced consequences for her explosive behavior, Natalie was there to smooth it over, to blame Dominic, and to reinforce the idea that MacKenzie was always the victim. This toxic family dynamic created a dangerous sense of impunity in MacKenzie's mind. She believed she could act without fear of consequence because her family would always be there to clean up the wreckage. And on July 31st, she tested that theory in the most horrific way imaginable. To understand the tragic inevitability of what happened on Progress Drive, one must look closely at the trail of digital breadcrumbs left behind in the months leading up to the crash. For years, the turbulent relationship between MacKenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo played out not just in the physical world, but across thousands of pages of text messages, frantic phone calls, and audio recordings. While the public trial and subsequent media coverage painted a picture of a sudden, explosive tragedy, the digital reality reveals a slow-burning fuse that had been lit long before. The warning signs were not merely subtle hints, they were screaming red flags. In the privacy of their text messages, the dynamic between MacKenzie and Dominic was defined by extreme toxicity, mutual manipulation, and physical threats. Dominic's phone, recovered by investigators, contained a horrifying archive of MacKenzie's escalating anger. In messages dating back to early 2020, MacKenzie's expressions of rage went far beyond typical teenage arguments. In one chilling exchange, she explicitly stated to Dominic that she wanted to kill someone. In others, Dominic pleaded with her to calm down, reminding her of terrifying incidents where she had threatened to stab him in the eye. But the abuse was not just verbal. It was physical, and it was directly tied to the very weapon she would eventually use to end his life, her car. 5 months before the crash, Dominic sent desperate texts warning MacKenzie that she was driving like a maniac, pleading with her to slow down and stop risking their lives. He described her erratic behavior behind the wheel as a recurring nightmare, a tool she used to terrify him whenever she didn't get her way. The escalations only grew more intense as the summer of 22 approached. Just 2 weeks before the fatal impact, a terrifying incident occurred that serves as an eerie dress rehearsal for the final crash. Dominic, thoroughly shaken by MacKenzie's volatile behavior, called his mother in a state of panic, begging for someone to come and rescue him because MacKenzie was driving erratically and refusing to let him out. When a family friend arrived to pick Dominic up, they witnessed a chaotic scene. MacKenzie was screaming at the top of her lungs, physically striking Dominic with her hands, and shrieking a chilling promise that now echoes with haunting precision. "I'm going to wreck this car right now." Behind closed doors, the Shirilla family was fully aware of the chaos. In March of 2020, police and emergency services had been called to the Shirilla residence following a suicide threat made by a then 15-year-old MacKenzie. Yet, in a pattern of behavior that would define their response to her actions, her parents brushed the incident aside. They told responding officers they did not believe her threats were real, refusing to seek psychiatric hospitalization. Her mother, Natalie, would later maintain under oath that she never perceived her daughter as genuinely troubled or suicidal. This dismissive attitude extended to MacKenzie's toxic behavior toward Dominic. When Dominic's brother witnessed the couple in violent disputes, he often watched as Dominic was forced to call MacKenzie's parents to pick her up because she refused to leave his family's home. Instead of addressing the deep-seated rage eating away at their daughter, the Shirillas repeatedly smoothed over the cracks, enabling a sense of absolute invincibility in MacKenzie's mind. In her world, there were no boundaries, no consequences, and no actions too extreme to be swept under the rug. She was a ticking time bomb, and those closest to her were actively disabling the alarms. To truly understand what the mainstream documentaries and high-profile specials omitted, we must look closely at the immediate aftermath of the crash and the chilling behavior of MacKenzie Shirilla and her mother, Natalie, while they believed the world wasn't watching. In the days and weeks following the catastrophic collision on Progress Drive, the Shirilla family did not react with the quiet, devastating grief of a family processing an unspeakable tragedy. Instead, they immediately went on the defensive, launching a calculated campaign to protect MacKenzie from criminal liability, even as two young men lay in cold graves. While the public was led to believe MacKenzie was a deeply traumatized survivor suffering from amnesia, her private actions painted a vastly different picture. While still recovering in the hospital, recovering from injuries that were remarkably non-life-threatening compared to the total annihilation of the car's front end, MacKenzie was already active on social media. She wasn't mourning. Instead, she was curate posting, looking for ways to preserve her public image. More shockingly, she began attending music festivals and posting videos of herself dancing, smiling, and enjoying life, mere weeks after she had guided her boyfriend and his friend to their deaths. But the most damning details lie in the recorded phone calls and the behavior of her mother, Natalie Shirilla. During MacKenzie's stay in the psychiatric ward and subsequent detention, the jailhouse phone calls between mother and daughter revealed a disturbing lack of empathy for Dominic Russo and Davian Pratt. In these conversations, Natalie did not press her daughter for the truth, nor did she express horror at the loss of two innocent lives. Instead, the conversations focused heavily on MacKenzie's comfort, how to manipulate public perception, and a shared, unspoken agreement to treat the crash as an unpredictable, tragic medical emergency. Natalie Shirilla actively championed the narrative that MacKenzie had simply fainted or suffered a sudden, inexplicable medical episode behind the wheel. The family went so far as to suggest that MacKenzie had a pre-existing condition, such as POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which causes lightheadedness or fainting. They claimed this invisible illness was the true culprit behind the vehicle launching to 100 miles per hour down a dead-end road. Yet, investigators quickly uncovered that MacKenzie had no documented medical history of fainting while driving, nor did she have any restrictions on her driver's license. Even more telling was the family's reaction to the digital evidence. When police began searching for the phones of the victims, they encountered resistance and deflection. The Shirillas knew what was on those phones. They knew about the threats to crash the car, the screaming matches, and the trail of text messages documenting MacKenzie's escalating physical abuse of Dominic. The defense team, heavily supported and funded by the family, tried desperately to block this digital trail from entering the courtroom. They tried to paint the relationship as a typical, albeit dramatic, teenage romance. But the texts and calls told a story of a mother who had spent years cleaning up her daughter's messes, now facing a mess too large, too bloody, and too public to ever be swept away. While Dominic's and Davian's mothers sat in agonizing silence, watching the girl who killed their sons perform grief for the cameras, the Shirilla family was busy behind the scenes, trying to ensure that the golden child would never have to pay for the lives she had so ruthlessly stolen. The transition from toxic threats to physical reality occurred in the dark, silent hours of July 31st, 22. It was a night that began with seeming normalcy but quickly descended into the familiar, suffocating pattern of conflict. MacKenzie, Dominic, and Davian had spent the evening hanging out, but beneath the surface, the tension was reaching a boiling point. The digital trail from that night reveals a sudden, sharp escalation, a shift from mere arguments to a cold, calculated decision. As the clock ticked past 5 in the morning, MacKenzie got behind the wheel of her black Toyota Camry. Dominic sat in the passenger seat. Davian was in the back. What they did not know was that they were no longer passengers in a car. They were captives in a weapon. MacKenzie drove toward the Plastipac Business Park, an isolated area she had scouted out just days prior. Her driving was deliberate. She navigated the suburban streets normally, showing full control of her faculties, waiting for the right moment. Then she turned onto Progress Drive. The telematics data recovered from the vehicle's computer black box would later tell the terrifying, objective truth of those final seconds. MacKenzie did not drift off the road. She did not fall asleep. Instead, she pressed her foot flat against the accelerator. The engine roared as the car rapidly surged from a normal speed to 50, then 70, and finally to a staggering 100 miles per hour. The data proved there was absolutely no attempt to apply the brakes. There was no sudden panic steer. With absolute precision, MacKenzie steered the vehicle directly toward the brick corner of Plux Cleaners. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. The kinetic energy of a 2-ton vehicle hitting a reinforced brick wall at triple-digit speeds was equivalent to falling from a 10-story building. The sound of the crash echoed like a bomb through the empty business park, a violent culmination of months of unchecked rage and enabling. Dominic and Davian never stood a chance. The steering column and dashboard collapsed inward, killing both young men on impact. Yet miraculously, the driver's side safety cage remained just intact enough to preserve MacKenzie's life. When she was found, she was trapped but breathing, the sole survivor of a devastation she had engineered. It was a crime born of obsession, executed with terrifying resolve, leaving behind a scene of shattered metal, broken brick, and 2 stolen lives. While the physical wreckage of the Toyota Camry lay in the tow yard, a silent battle over information began behind the scenes. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, the narrative of a tragic, blameless medical emergency was aggressively put forward by MacKenzie's family. They pointed to her diagnosis of POTS, suggesting she had simply fainted at the wheel. However, the Strongsville police and Cuyahoga County prosecutors began uncovering a trail of evidence that told a much more calculated story. The first major breakthrough came from the vehicle's event data recorder, the black box. The digital forensics dismantled the medical emergency theory entirely. The data showed that in the final seconds before impact, the accelerator pedal was depressed to 100% capacity, pushing the car to 96 miles per hour. Crucially, the brakes were never applied. Investigators also noted that the road featured a slight dogleg curve just before the crash site. To navigate this turn at nearly 100 miles per hour without spinning out required active, precise steering. A person who had completely fainted or lost consciousness would not have been able to keep the vehicle on its path to make that turn before colliding directly with the brick wall. The digital trail stretched far beyond the car itself. Police obtained a warrant to track GPS data from MacKenzie's phone and vehicle. What they discovered shook the foundation of her defense. Just 3 days before the fatal crash, MacKenzie had visited this exact, secluded business park on Progress Drive. To prosecutors, this wasn't a random drive. It was a scouting mission, a test run for the location she would eventually choose to carry out her plan. But perhaps the most shocking and highly hidden evidence lay within the jailhouse phone lines after MacKenzie's arrest. Believing their conversations were being recorded, MacKenzie and her mother, Natalie, went to extraordinary lengths to bypass the facility's monitoring systems. Prosecutors revealed that the mother and daughter had actually developed and communicated in a private, fabricated coded language. When investigators successfully decoded the secret language, the true nature of their coordination was exposed. In one of the decoded exchanges, MacKenzie could be heard asking her mother if they could tell the police that she had suffered a seizure right before the crash occurred. Rather than counseling her daughter to speak the absolute truth, the communication focused entirely on shifting the blame and building an airtight story. The decoded calls, along with standard recordings where her mother referred to the victims' families in highly disparaging terms, became devastating evidence of a coordinated attempt to evade justice, a pattern of deflection that had finally run out of road. In August of 2023, the reckoning finally arrived in a Cuyahoga County courtroom. Because MacKenzie Shirilla was 17 at the time of the crash, her defense team had lobbied to keep her in the juvenile system, but the sheer gravity and calculated nature of her actions saw her tried as an adult. Over the course of a tense bench trial, Judge Nancy Margaret Russo presided over a mountain of objective forensic and digital evidence that left no room for reasonable doubt. The prosecution laid out a devastating case, systematically dismantling the narrative of an accidental medical emergency. The event data recorder, the lack of brake usage, the high-speed steering, and the chilling pre-crash scouting of progress drive all pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. On August 14, 23, Judge Russo delivered a scathing verdict. She found MacKenzie guilty on all 12 felony counts, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, and 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, alongside drug possession charges for the psilocybin mushrooms and digital scale found in her possession at the scene. In her final summation, Judge Russo did not mince words, describing the final seconds inside the Toyota Camry as a deliberate, terrifying mission of death. The judge emphasized that MacKenzie had controlled the vehicle with precision, steering her passengers toward a brick wall to settle a toxic dispute once and for all. 1 week later, the court gathered for sentencing. The atmosphere in the room was thick with grief and anger. The victims' families pleaded with the court to run MacKenzie's sentences consecutively, which would have kept her behind bars for a minimum of 30 years to life. However, Judge Russo ultimately sentenced the 19-year-old to 2 concurrent life sentences, carrying a minimum of 15 years before she would first become eligible for parole. Though the defense continued to frame her as a tragic teenager who had simply made a catastrophic error, the law had officially stamped her actions with the heaviest label possible: cold-blooded, premeditated murder.
So she's sentenced on count 2, the murder of Davion Flanagan, 15 years to life. She's sentenced on count 1, the murder of Dominic Russo, 15 years to life, to be served concurrent to each other, with credit for time served. I'll waive fines, fees, and costs, and your appellate counsel will be assigned. Are there any questions from the state?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
The verdict and the sentencing did not bring an end to the bitter war between the families, nor did it silence the people who had spent years shielding MacKenzie Shirilla from the consequences of her own actions. Instead, the legal conclusion of the case only exposed the deep, raw divide between those who mourned the 2 young lives stolen on Progress Drive and a family that refused to accept the reality of what their daughter had done. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Pratt, the courtroom was a place of unbearable, suffocating grief. They had spent over a year watching MacKenzie appear in court, often looking detached, while the graphic details of their son's final moments were picked apart by lawyers and reconstruction experts. In their emotional victim impact statements, they spoke of the empty chairs at their dinner tables, the unfinished dreams of two promising young men, and the agonizing knowledge that their boys' lives had been snuffed out in a flash of calculated rage. To them, justice was served, but it was a cold, hollow victory that could never bring their children back. But on the other side of the courtroom, the Shirilla family's reaction was not one of quiet reflection or accountability. Almost immediately, Steve and Natalie Shirilla launched a highly vocal public campaign to protest the court's decision, actively claiming that the justice system had failed. In interviews and public statements, they continued to fiercely defend MacKenzie, insisting that she was completely innocent of murder and demanding that critics show them one piece of evidence, proving she crashed the car on purpose. To them, the event data recorder's lack of braking, the high-speed steering, and the scouting of the business park were all merely circumstantial, overshadowed by their unwavering belief that their daughter had simply suffered a medical emergency. Even behind bars, the efforts to shift blame and control the narrative did not stop. The fight to overturn her conviction became an ongoing crusade for her parents, who publicly vowed to fight indefinitely. Natalie Shirilla began meticulously combing through past text messages and records, attempting to introduce new angles to support appeals, including claims that it was Dominic, not MacKenzie, who had exhibited erratic behavior behind the wheel in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Rather than offering space for healing, the post-trial months were filled with a relentless, public campaign of denial, leaving the grieving families of the victims to repeatedly face the reopening of their deepest wounds. It became chillingly clear that even with a life sentence handed down, the culture of enabling that had surrounded MacKenzie since her teenage years was still very much alive, refusing to let her carry the weight of her own actions. The tragedy of Progress Drive remains etched into the history of Strongsville, Ohio, as a stark reminder of the devastating intersection between toxic relationships and an unchecked culture of enablement. Dominic Russo and Davian Pratt had their futures stolen in a single, violent instant, leaving behind shattered families and a community forever changed by the loss. While the legal system eventually handed down its judgment, the scars left behind by the events of July 31st, 22, continue to run deep. When looking beyond the headlines and the courtroom battles, this case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about accountability and the warning signs we choose to see or ignore. It leaves behind a lingering, profound question. When a pattern of dangerous behavior is continually minimized and shielded by those closest to it, where does the true responsibility for the ultimate tragedy lie? What are your thoughts on how this case unfolded and the hidden evidence that never made it into the mainstream documentaries? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this deep dive investigative report insightful, please take a moment to support the channel. Hit that like button, subscribe to True Crime Exposure, turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode, and share this video to help us continue bringing these untold stories to light. Thank you for watching.